the sycamore tree.
Hi, I'm JR, back with Dr. Robert. In this edition, we are going to be talking about Birds Gotta Fly, which, as I alluded to last time, I think feels like a bit of a fresh start for you. And I think there are external reasons for that too, which we'll go into. But just before we get there, I realised that when we were doing Flatlands, we didn't talk about Up to Me. And I don't suppose there's necessarily a massive amount to be said about that song in and of itself. But I think Up to Me is a little bit like Staring Down the Bird, in that the way it's recorded or the way it's structured feels a little bit like what happens with Birds Gotta Fly. So I'm going to throw out like a random thought at you. And I don't really truly believe this thought myself, but I want to maybe use this thought as a sort of launching pad for the rest of the conversation. But I think Birds Gotta Fly is your indie stroke rock album. And I don't necessarily mean that literally, but I think in some ways you're writing songs here a little bit like an indie band or a rock band might write songs, where it sounds to me like you're starting with the guitar riff and building out around from that, rather than necessarily doing things in sort of various other ways that you might do otherwise. This is sort of kind of riff heavy, this album, not necessarily all the way through, but that's the sort of texture that's sort of the first impression you get listening to it. So what do you think? Is this your indie album? Is this your rock album?
Well, I can see why you think that. It's a bit of an outlier, this album, really, I think, sonically.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, a lot of them are just, it depends on who is about at the time as well, playing with me. So I went up to Bethesda again.
Yeah.
To my friend Laurie's studio in Bethesda in North Wales, and his in-house engineer is a guy called David Wrench, who's very famous now. He's a top producer, and I caught him when he was still house producer at Bethesda, so he helped me a lot. And there was a band that I got to know, a young band from Suffolk called The Bark, who have gone on to do other things. They changed their name, I think, and all sorts, but they were kind of backing me on things. So I reckon some of that young blood might have come into the equation in the way I was thinking about writing and stuff. And I think there's not much soul on this record. There's not much, that in as much as my default kind of writing would be, towards that kind of soul thing that I grew up with. There's really not a lot of that. So yeah, it's a bit of an outlier. I mean, the thing was, I knew when I recorded this, 99, was it 99 or even a bit late, was that I was leaving, that we were gonna move to Spain. We'd made that decision. We were moving on. So there was a lot of going through my head. I went up and I went alone and did this up in Wales, and a couple of people came to visit me, but basically I was there for a month of rain. It rained every day. It did rain every day.
Oh wow.
Because every day I walked from the studio down into the village to buy some food, and I got soaked every day. And so I think that really got into my psyche, and it made me think, I'm out of here. It's time for a big change. I had a young family. I wanted to move to Spain and try something different. So there was a kind of freedom to it, but also I'd met EC1, East Central One, the label.
Yeah.
Jamie Spencer and people like that were very helpful, very positive, and brought some of my other albums back and put them out again, So it felt good, but I also knew that it was the end of something, that I was going to move, and I had no idea that moving to Spain, what would that mean for my music? Would I be able to carry on? I just knew that I had to do something. I had to change things up. I felt a bit, I've been through the 90s now at this point.
Yeah.
Well, I was an outside figure, but I was there, but I was very much an outside figure. I was an 80s figure for most people, although I was involved in things like the Weller thing and all that, and Beth Orton and everything, and putting out albums all the time. I was very much on the outside of everything at that point. And so I felt that I needed to shake things up in my own life. So this album it felt like a full stop rather than a new start.
Okay, let's just talk a little bit about it. The move. Did you decide on a place first and that you would move thereafter? Or did you just say, we need to move, and then it was a case of deciding where you'd go?
No, I knew we always had our eye on Spain. I mean, Michelle and I always loved it here. We toured a lot in the 80s, the band. We did well here. So we still play here now. So I'd sort of seen a lot of it, and I had friends in this particular area down near Granada. So, and the kids were getting to the age where we had to do it now in order for it to have an effect on them and for them to learn the language and integrate, blah, 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 and have another culture. And, and also I was living at the end in Cambridgeshire, having lived in Oxfordshire, moved out of London. Cambridgeshire to be near Michelle's mum. But to be honest, I hated the Shires. I mean, it's Tory England. It's just monoculture. I lived in Brixton most of the time during the 80s, and I love London, and I still love London, and I love the multiculturalism of London. I know some people find multiculturalism a negative. I love it. You get on the tube and you hear all these accents and you see all this, and to me, it's one of the most magical places on earth on a good day, London. So I was missing that a lot because I suddenly found myself out in the Shires, and I thought, oh God, this is where the Tories get all their votes,
But now you've gone even more rural in a way. You've gone even further, haven't you?
Where I am now is, it's half North African. It's, Andalusia is, it's a real mixture. Now this doesn't feel. I mean, it's all, you would think it's rural but Granada's just up the road. And it's a very different vibe. I think what I found, what I'd had enough of was that kind of English rural Tory mentality, which I found to be stifling, And I thought, I don't want to be here anymore. I'd grown up in it as a teenager. I knew what it was about in King's Lynn, and I didn't want my kids. I wanted them to have something else.
Yeah.
So this album was informed by a kind of flight, a kind of.
Well, that comes up in the lyrics, doesn't it?
Yeah. There's a lot of that. Of course, you take yourself with you wherever you go. We all know that. But it wasn't just about me. I had the responsibility to the family, and I wanted to be brave, and I'm really glad that we did it. So otherwise it would have felt, it would have been a very different journey, I think.
Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about the lyrics, because the lyrics in this album, I think what you do here in terms of the songs is something that becomes more and more frequent among your sort of latter day albums, is that you'll have a theme, and some of the songs will be in the theme, which gives the album a kind of coherency. But then in between those songs, there'll be other just sort of more, I hate to say the word standard, because that makes it sound like there's something standard about them. And there isn't. We'll talk about Still Got a Lot to Learn. That's a standard Dr. Robert song, but there's nothing whatsoever standard about it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But in between things like Birds Gotta Fly and A Single Summer, you've got a theme going on across the sort of first half of the album. And then in the second half of the album, it kind of settles into, and you do this a lot, I think, with, say, If Not Now, When, for example. About half that album is sort of like glam rock, and the rest of the album is kind of sort of standard Blow Monkeys almost. Right. And that happens here, and I think that this is kind of the first time you do that kind of thing. So you've got things like A Single Summer, Blue Skies, which sound very much like a new kind of thing you're doing. And then towards the end of the album, you've got things like, well, no, actually, on this album, there's not an awful lot of it. But things like Still Got a Lot to Learn, Feel Like Regular You.
Yeah.
Well, apart from the fact that you're sort of playing with a band, as it were, but not the band that you're used to necessarily, and apart from the fact that you've got your eyes on the horizon, as opposed to the album previous to this, Flatlands, is kind of a backwards looking, or it's looking around you at where you are then and where you're about to leave from if you had but known it. Yeah. This is an album about where you're going to. How much, what I'm really asking is, all of these things that I've just mentioned, are these accidental things? How much of it is deliberate? Are you actually did you actually sit down to make an album about moving forwards, or did it just happen that way?
I don't think I'm that calculated. I think what I learned to do as I got older was just let my subconscious kind of take over a bit more in the songwriting. So it became a little bit more impressionistic, and I tried to do something different with this because I didn't have. It wasn't just going to be me with an acoustic guitar, but I didn't really have a band at this time. So it was just people coming in, like John Lawrence plays on stage. He was in Gorky's Myonic Monkey or whatever.
I remember.
Which I loved, I loved them.
Zygotic Monkey, I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah.
And Nell Catchpole was part of the bar, but she played with Eno. She was doing a lot of soundtracks, and she played some fantastic, Single Summer. The violin solo on that is fantastic. And so it just evolved. And of course, I think I wrote a couple of the songs when I was there in the studio. Like, still got a little song, and I still got a lot to learn. So they're probably more traditional, and I would have just recorded those with the band, whoever was around that day. But it's not that thought out. No, I mean it may seem like that, but it's not really. I mean, I had I think Birds Gotta Fly, the actual tune. I started on that at home, and things like Blue Skies. I had that kind of loop going that I'd made up, and I was working with my friend Marius on that and stuff. But it was just The Cloud is an older one that comes from sort of. Initially, that was something that we did in Starjuice, that band that I had for a couple of years back then.
Right.
So they just. It just fell into place that way. It wasn't a plan. I don't really sit and plan albums like in that sense, because I've never been a big fan of concept albums or anything like that. So if it seems like that to you, it's pure luck.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing about it that sort of sits out, as I said before, is it feels like it's built around riffs. And I think it feels to me, and what you've just said about The Cloud, about that having started with Starjuice, is maybe quite telling, because it feels to me like what you're doing with this album for the first time since the Blow Monkeys split up. Towards the end of the Blow Monkeys, you'd write a lot of stuff, and especially, I suppose, things like Weight and Choice, are stuff that are built around like kind of the piano stuff that was going on with house music, and it's built around a riff and a rhythm.
Yeah.
And this album in particular feels to me like you're sort of replicating the feel and the tone and the tension of that kind of songwriting, but with natural instruments. So rather than drum machines and sort of keyboards, this is guitars and actual drummers. Yeah. But you're sort of replicating the...
Yeah, well, there's drum machines, The Cloud, Blue Skies, Single Summer, drum machines. But then
they've got very natural guitar sounds over the top.
Yeah, drum machines with acoustic guitars. And there was that kind of getting back to the Starjuice thing. There were bands like Ultramarine and bands like that. They were kind of calling electro folk around the sort of early 90s, which I kind of liked. I liked the idea of that. That was kind of what we were trying to do with Starjuice. But then, of course, Benny left, and I took a different path and did Realms of Gold.
Well, just to cut in, Beth Orton was part of that movement, wasn't she? I think, sort of.
Yeah, because Beth went out with, oh God, I can't remember his name, the producer guy.
The guy from the House Martins, wasn't it?
No. He produced Blur's 13, I can't remember his name.
I know who you mean, though, yeah.
Beth was involved in a lot of that kind of scene. She was the come-down queen, at the kind of festivals and all that. So, there was a bit of that. Yeah. I mean, I really like a Single Summer. Single Summer is one of my... I still play it sometimes on a solo gig, on a rare solo gig, because I can just play it on acoustic guitar. It's got that kind of... Well, how would I say? It's almost like Deborah, but Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's got that insistent...
Yeah.
Yeah, and then... So...
in fact, that sort of what Blue Skies has as well, although Blue Skies is
Yeah.
sort of a more slow, kind of more laid back version of something similar.
Yeah.
Blue Skies kind of feels almost like a polka or something like that, almost.
Yeah, it's got.
Don't it-
I think it was influenced by Chaz and Dave.
Yeah,
always
that doesn't
like
surprise
their
me.
Seriously. It
Mm.
had that kind of like comic book sort of strut, and then I just wanted to do a chant and a simple thing over it. And Marius did a little bit of magic on his Oscar and his programming,
Mm.
you know. And
Yeah, they've all got these-
the Nearly Worm is one that I always think, no, that was a missed opportunity because it's got the makings of a really good song, but I didn't really finish it. I mean, the Nearly Worm comes from my obsession with boxing, because
Oh, okay, yeah.
it's Muhammad Ali described it when he got hit. No one ever stopped him, right? No one ever knocked him out. But when he got hit and you lose your senses, he called it the Nearly Worm. When you're in that state, you know, if Joe Frazier caught him and put him on the floor and he had to get up and fight on, he'd be disorientated, and he called it the Nearly Worm. And I like that as a kind of metaphor, and I thought I'll take that because, you know, as you know, boxing was a big thing for me when I was growing up because of my father,
Right.
and because of sort of being, you know, I was obsessed with it, you know, staying up late and watching Ali and all that in the 70s and everything. So, and I just felt that I didn't complete that song properly.
And actually, given what I said before, The Nearly Room is probably the one song on here, maybe apart from Phantom World, that actually does sound like sort of, I hate to say indie music, because I don't think it's quite that, but it's got that sort of guitar and bass led
Yeah.
sort of songwritery thing going on.
Yeah, it does. And things like Phantom World and Small Victories are quite odd for me because they're quite rocky. They're quite sort of almost,
Well,
you know.
I was going to say Small Victories. Because I've listened to this through 4 or 5 times in this sort of fortnight since we spoke, and
Yeah.
every time Small Victories come on, I keep thinking to myself, Dr. Robert says he's never done a heavy metal song, but come on, that's what this is.
Well, I wouldn't say it's heavy metal.
It's your version of heavy.
I mean, it's obviously it's more. It's if it's anything, it's got more grunge kind of thing to it. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I probably was listening to quite a lot of Neil Young. There was a point where I got into Neil Young, and like everything, I have to buy everything. I have to listen to everything by everybody. So I would have gone through Neil Young's things like Weld and Zuma and these things where it's just like loud guitars. But he plays loud guitar like a loud acoustic. The way he plays it, it's not like macho. It's just loud and distorted, and I love that. You know, I love that about him.
And just after grunge broke, there was a fashion for sort of grunge bands doing sort of not necessarily mashups with hip hop, but taking that influence. And you'd get a lot of music sort of in the early to mid 90s, just before Britpop, which was very heavy guitar music, but done with a dance sensibility. And that's what Small Victories feels like. It feels like sort of like loud guitars, but very funky with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funky thing is always important. Nearly Worm's got a kind of funky bass line to it. Phantom World, you know, it swings. I mean, even though I say so myself, that's kind of like a vital ingredient for me is the feel. You know, if there's anything that really defines anything that I ever do, I think it's just my feel on rhythm, on guitar, on whatever it is that we do. That's just my default. You know, every human being has that. But I try to keep to that. I try to keep true to that because that feels right for me. So even on something like Small Victories, which is kind of motoring along, I mean, I cut the drums up. I made some drums up with the guy and chopped them up, and they're quite mad. I remember playing it to Dave Wrench, and he said, "Well, what the hell's that? You know, how are you going to put anything on top of that? It doesn't." But I could hear where it needed to fall. You know, I could hear it. So, but yeah, it's a mad one. And I mean, it's obviously. I think there were obvious stuff in there which is probably influenced by things like Nirvana and Blur and things like that. I think there's probably a realization of that kind of sound in my thinking at the time. But why not? I had fun with it, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's what I like about it. Because, see, when you said, when we started doing this, you mentioned this and said this is one of the albums of yours that gets talked about the least. Which, actually, you know, because I didn't know, but that absolutely took me sideways. Because, you know, when I think Dr. Robert's solo albums, this is not necessarily the one I prefer, but it's the one that stands out to me the most, because I think this is sort of the biggest, the brashest, the most colourful of the albums. And although I think, say, probably given my own sensibilities, something like Out There, or even Flutes and Bones, might be something that I prefer musically. This is the one that says to me, here's an album. And it seems really odd that that's not been picked up on, especially given that this has got some really great songs on it, like you mentioned, A Single Summer. The thing about that is, like Birds Gotta Fly, those first two songs on here, neither of them seem to have an awful lot going on lyrically. But what they're doing is it feels like they're sort of saying to the listener, right, you've got to sit up and take notice, because this is not what you were expecting when you put this album on. And Birds Gotta Fly especially, it's got that violin thing that comes in, and it sounds like it's doing a great big circle, like a big crow or a vulture or something, circling around the rest of the music. And then the music comes in inside it, and it feels like this amazing soundscape with just this enough lyric to keep the listener thinking, oh, this is a song. But apart from that, it just feels like a epic soundscape, epic soundtrack from something.
No, I like that one too. Birds Gotta Fly, it works. You know,
and A Single Summer comes on immediately afterwards and sort of does the same thing, but sounds a little bit more like a song. So it's like you're reasoning.
That's Nell Catchpole played violin on both those tracks, and she's fantastic. She's got this understanding. She comes from, like I said, she does a lot of work with Eno. She still does and stuff, and she's got that kind of abstract kind of way of putting things together, which kind of indefinable really to pinpoint why, but it just sounds like that, and it really worked with me.
Well, once you're about 3 minutes into A Single Summer, you forget it's a violin. And by this point, the vocals, I think, have pretty much all finished as well. And so by that point, the last sort of minute or so of A Single Summer, it just sounds like this sort of sonic coalescence of all these elements that you can't quite put your finger on how it's working or why it's working, but it's amazing, really.
It's got an odd chord progression as well, you know. For me, I remember thinking, you know, that's going somewhere new. It just it's almost like there's a couple on. I mean, it's almost like klezmer, you know, this kind of like, you know, the kind of Jewish folk music.
Oh yes, of course, yeah.
There's a bit of that in there, you know. And then A Sycamore Tree has got a bit of that, you know.
Well, Sycamore Tree, we'll come to the sort of Sycamore Tree and
thing, you know, and Blue Skies. They've all got these kind of repetitive, insistent acoustic guitar figures with drum machines. So that would be. So it's not really related to any of my other solo albums, actually. When you put it that way, I understand. I can see that.
Yeah, it definitely stands apart. Yeah, we'll come to some of those latter songs in a second, because I think there's quite a bit to be said or to be asked about some of those. For example, I'm going to give you a little teaser now. I'm going to let you think about this for a few minutes before we come back to it, but I want to know, to whom are you writing a little song, or a little song of hate, to give it what it should have been its full title, maybe? But I'll come back to that question, because I want a definite answer to that. Even if there isn't one, you can make something up. The Cloud, that it sounds like something out of some kind of 60s spy-fi thing over the top of some kind of sort of slightly acoustic-y big. That sounds a little bit like Britpop had happened, but you were going back to something entirely separate from Britpop. But again, I think The Cloud sounds more like the work of a sort of standard guitar-y band doing something outside their comfort zone. then it sounds like you, if you know what I mean. It sort of sounds like it's come from somewhere else, and somehow you're the one that's kind of made yourself a vessel for it to appear. It's an amazing song, The Cloud, I think.
Yeah, well, I'll take that. I'm happy to make myself a vessel of myself. It's how I feel most comfortable. Just being a kind of floating receptacle for ideas that might just want to pass through. You know, it's a MIDI guitar. It says, like, I'm reading the thing. I can remember I've got this old MIDI guitar that I bought from Woolworths, and that's got,
that'll be the distinctive sound. Yeah.
Sound on it. Yeah, it's got a bit of psychedelic vibes to it, laid back. Friend that I had called Rob Appleton playing harmonica, who I met in Cambridge, amazing harmonica player. In fact, on Sycamore Tree, he really shines. In fact, we did Sycamore Tree live, and I think he passed out at the end of it because he just had to blow all the way through it like that. Yeah, I mean, like I said, The Cloud comes from quite a bit earlier. But again, you know, the Starjuice time. So it would have been written around that time. And I would have been it would have been, it's influenced by me beginning to kind of read. When I left London and I went to go up to Kent, when I left and went to Oxford, you know, I really immersed myself in a lot of literature and a lot of philosophy and a lot of religious writing. And I think there's an essay called The Cloud of Unknowing by some saint or other. And I think that's where I got that idea from. Because a lot of the stuff, a lot of lyrically, it's all about a gradual awakening and a gradual realization that all the things that you thought were important when you were young are not. And then what's really important is the here and now and the very small things that happen in a day. You might glimpse, the things that you might have a moment with your dog, or you might see a flower, or you might see somebody in the street being kind to someone, and not, oh, my career and how famous and how big and how, you know, all that. That all falls away. So I think the whole of my career has been a very gradual realization of what's important.
It feels these songs,
you know, and you never stop on that. You know, that's why there's, you know, great writers, far better than me, like say Leonard Cohen or David Bowie, and when they make these albums at the end of their lives, when they know they're dying. I mean, Black Star and that last one that Leonard Cohen did, or most things that Tom Waits writes, or Nick Cave, where he is now. Nick Cave is kind of, he's turned from being a kind of Iggy Pop type performer into almost being a preacher. You know, when he does, they're almost like congregations, his gigs now. Because there's an understanding that he's been through a tremendous amount of suffering, but has somehow picked up the essence of what existence is all about. And I think that's the journey that, as a songwriter, we're all on. Otherwise, you're just repeating yourself and you're staying in some kind of immature version of yourself. Yeah. So I can see the beginnings of that in some of these songs that date back to the time when the Blow Monkeys ended and I started doing solo things.
Oh, for sure. Well, this feels like an album where lyrically and musically you're sort of brushing stuff out of the street ahead of you to give yourself a clear path, and suddenly you can see the horizon maybe. And suddenly you might not necessarily be able to...
It's an album made by somebody who has no expectations of it being heard by anybody. Because when I made it, I didn't have the deal, so I didn't even know that this was going to come out. And at this point, like I said, I've been through the 90s. And of course, people had bought Realms of Gold, and there were things that were happening with stuff off of Flatlands. But a few of them were completely... Bethesda was, I think, completely ignored. I don't even remember a review for it. This got a few reviews, but I got to the point where I had a very hardcore following that made it worthwhile making records.
Yeah.
And doing gigs. But I really didn't give a shit because I had no expectation. It wasn't like, oh, you got to get this one on the radio, or you got to do this, all that had gone. So, and it was a freedom in a way. it was scary too, because I'm thinking, well, how will I be able to survive? And will I be able to go to Spain and survive? Will I be able to? Luckily, they invented the internet. I don't think I would have been able to do it without that.
Right.
Of course, things changed because I got the band back together and we went on this whole rebirth. But at this point, it feels like risk taking. I can see that that's where I was, and that's a good thing. That's a good place to be to make an album, into going into somewhere where you don't feel really comfortable.
And yet the weird thing about it is, with things like A Single Summer and Blue Skies, you come up with some of the catchiest things you've ever done. And if you'd have had a bit more muscle behind you, who knows? But I think those should have been hits, frankly.
Well,
or if not hits.
My life is full of things that should have been hits. But, you know, luckily I've had a few as well, so I'm not complaining. So I'm very lucky, you know. But I don't even know what hit is anymore and whether it matters. You know, all that stuff is changed so much.
Yeah,
we're on the cusp of that change already at this point. So there's a realization that I'm making this record really. Well, I didn't know who I'm making this record for.
Yeah.
Self, I had no idea.
Yeah, and you're right. In this day and age, actually, in the last 20 years, I don't think the charts. Well, who takes any notice of what's in the charts anymore?
Nobody.
No, people just. Young people listen to playlists, not to charts. They don't listen to charts; they listen to playlists.
Exactly. And yeah, the way music is listened to and consumed and its place in culture has changed so much that all you have to do is carve out your own path and hope to catch a few along the way and just do your best and just continue to grow. Because I'm always amazed and touched if someone. That's why I love playing live, because if I come out afterwards and I meet somebody who says that they really like this song from this album, and it's often quite surprising, and it might be a recent one, you know, that stays with me. That makes everything worthwhile, actually, because that's all you're after, really. You know, as long as there's enough, as somebody gets touched or moved by it, then really that's all you can do. It's out of your hands at that point. But the industry side, the charts, the everything, it means nothing really anymore.
Not now, no. Right.
Anyway.
Staying on that subject, but going back to the subject of this is an album about somebody who's, you know, realised that all the things maybe that they thought were true aren't necessarily true. So still got a lot to learn. Your best song ever?
No.
Certainly got to be in contention.
Do you think so?
I think so. It's absolutely gorgeous.
It's a good one. None of it's my best ever, but yeah, you know, I understand. I went back to it for Monk's Road, and somebody sang a version of it. So I obviously thought something. Yeah, it's very simple. It just like all the best ones. They're always simple, actually. The best ones. I think
sometimes,
I think it's in another one. It's in open tuning. And because I'm very limited in open tuning, I think it might be open G. I've only got a couple of places I can go. So it's about timing, and the timing's quite good on it. It's got Walkerish thing, but also, you know, I think lyrically, I probably nailed it without having to say too much.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, it's got bongos. It's got that sort of Dr. Robert rhythm thing going on that I've talked about before. And that sort of, I think, because we talked about that with Flatlands, about a couple of tracks that had that sort of thing going on Flatlands. Here again, it feels like really pared back, but really pared back to the things that matter. And those sort of bongos that are sort of underpinning this, they're so simple. But deceivingly so, because what they're actually doing is, this song, it feels like it's sort of just drifting over the top of this driving thing that's underneath, but it's driving it so subtly. The song, it feels as light as air, and yet it's really got a hook and a movement and a sort of weight to it as well. I think it's, you know, it's cards on the table. It's not my all-time favourite song off yours, but I definitely think it's in contention for being part of that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, if we do a compilation of the best of, then that would probably go on it somewhere. I agree with you, because I also like it lyrically. You know, I used to pay lip service to a code I didn't believe in. I was good at sophisticated thieving. That's about growing up and realizing that, you know,
that the world isn't. Yeah,
I really didn't belong. We didn't, the band, but especially I don't really kind of belong to a movement or school of, you know. I realised that I'm a bit of an outlier. There have been periods where people might say, "Oh, you're that, or you're this, or you're that," but I'm not really, because in the end, I think it's about trusting your imagination, and I don't like. I resist peer pressure and being put in a box. You're Britpop, you're soul, you're this, you're that, you're whatever it is, because you know I'm not just a musician, you know, and I try and do as many different types of things as I can, and be honest about what I'm feeling. So again, you know, at this point, I'm so out of the sort of realm of it all. I'm so far removed that there's a kind of freedom in that. So that I'm celebrating that. You know, hints of it earlier, like Comfort of the Clan in Realms of Gold and things like that. They were about the same thing. They were about, I need to get away from this place that people think that we belong, whatever that is, whatever they call it, fisty pop or 80s or all that crap. Because there's none of that, you know, that's not what, I didn't sit down as a 12-year-old and think, oh, when I go out, I want to be sophisti-pop, you know. Somebody just invented that. So that's, yeah, lyrically, I'm happy with that one. And if I was doing solo gigs, I'd probably put that in the set, you know.
Yeah.
There's a one or two where you think, I remember Paul Weller telling me, I said, what's the best song you've written, Paul? And he said, straight away, he said, Strange Town by The Jam. And I thought, oh yeah, no, I get that. He said, because every word falls in the right place and every chord and every beat, and it's effortless, and it just goes C, A minor, F, G. It's that classic thing, right? But it's just perfect.
Yeah.
You could do it. And well, there's not many I've got like that, but there's one or two that I might say, yeah, that I couldn't really, you know, Time Storm might be one, this might be one, Circular Key might be one, where I'd say, yeah, they feel complete. And then you've got things like the Nearly One, which is, it lives up to its name, it's not quite there. There's something missing. I might come back and finish it one day.
I like it though.
I know what you mean, but I can feel a laziness in it, in the writing that annoys me. It could have been better. It could have been better.
It feels like a song that lollops a bit, that one. But I kind of like that sometimes.
Well, there's nothing wrong with a good lollop.
Yeah.
Lollapalooza. But I don't. Again, you know, a little song. Who's it about? Well, I don't know, man. I mean, I think it's about disappointment with. It would have been about disappointment with politicians,
right?
With the, you know, we were waiting for Labour to get in after all these years of Thatcherism, and Blair comes along, and by the second term, I don't know when this was exactly, 99, but you know, they're starting to, like, there's wars in Iraq happening, there's all sorts, and you suddenly realise that all these guys are bought and paid for. You know, they're all in the pockets of, which we know now. And if anybody raises their head above the parapet who isn't in that circle, they get shot down. You know, we've seen that with people like Corbyn, that they don't stand a chance because they threaten the equilibrium too much. So someone like Blair can only get there if he goes and visits Rupert Murdoch, and if he goes and he sanitises what it is that he thinks he stands for so much that he might as well be the Tories. And so in the end, it's a disillusionment with the idea of achieving real change through the political system, especially in the UK. That was kind of what that was. Which, you know, there were days when I don't think that. There were days when I think, well, no, you can, and there are good people within that Labour Party, within that movement that will change it, you know. But that was coming, you know, there's probably a little bit too much cynicism in that song. It's also an early attempt it's almost like a country and western song, I think.
Oh, it is, yeah.
I was listening to a lot to...
well, you said last time, you talked about...
Hans Van Dam and Willie Nelson.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say Willie Nelson, you mentioned last time. And this feels like you've leaned even further into that. And last time you talked about Oh God, and now I'm trying to think. Was that I Guess This Is Goodbye?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's I Can't Remember the Last Time I Cried, actually, that we were talking about. Yes.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the fact, and I said, yes, now that you've mentioned it, I could hear Willie Nelson singing that. This feels like this goes even more into sort of standard country and western music than, say, Willie Nelson even. It feels, this definitely feels like you doing a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love the form, but you can distort it a bit by having lyrically and just the fact that I'm singing it. I mean, I'm not a country singer, but I do love the simplicity of the chord progressions in country and the storytelling narrative. And when you listening, because dear old Loretta Lynn died last week, I was listening to the Coal Miner's Daughter album again. I was just thinking, wow, there's just, I mean, and also the king of it all is Hank Williams. And when you listen to those, I mean, he's as important to me as Bob Dylan. He's the roots. He's like Chuck Berry or Little Richard. He's and that just the beautiful kind of arithmetic of the way that the chords fall together in country music. It's a fantastic base for telling stories over. So it's something that I'm interested in, but obviously there's no way in the world that I'm going to make a country record. It's going to be something else. But if you've got the rights, and also my voice now would suit it. You need to be able to command without being shrill. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You need to be able to to hold. So I think of those great writers like Chris Christopherson and people like that. There's something beautiful in that form. So this was a little beginning of that, I guess. I'd been listening to a lot, and of course, where I'd come from, country music was anathema. All the guys that I knew that were in music in London on my scene, and everyone would go, "No, fucking," it's right wing hillbilly music. It's not. There was so much more to it than that. You think Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, all those guys. Fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Fantastic.
Well,
and more modern, Steve Earle. I went to see Steve Earle live, and he was fantastic. Yeah.
Well, and what you do with this here as well is, because you've got that cornet, I always assumed it was a trumpet, but I'm looking now and it says it's a cornet over the top of it.
Yeah.
And then you use that to do something with the song that makes it not sound like a country song. So you manage to get that balance again.
Well, the thing is that Nick, who was in the Bark, only plays cornet. It wasn't. It wasn't one that I sat down and thought, "I'll tell you what, this needs a cornet or two." And he started playing it. I said, "I'll just double it, keep going," and it ended up sounding like some acid mariachi Mexican sort of thing. Like, where the hell did that come in? But it's so weird and celebratory that it's a marvelous noise.
Yeah. It doesn't quite sound like it belongs in a spaghetti western type of music, but somehow it seems to bridge that difference between the two and come up with something else altogether.
Yeah, but there's no point in just copying and just having a pedal steel, and there's no point in that. I mean, I'm not going to be. No. It's got to be something else.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and okay then. Speaking of something else, then the one track that we've not really talked about probably is, well, actually, Phantom World. We've not really talked about that. That's the one that feels the most sort of indie to me. It feels like a sort of upbeat indie track.
Yeah.
And I always thought,
I just wanted to play a bit
guitar-y bandy music almost.
Yeah. I love that, I love the Ramones, and I love the Saints and bands like that, and that kind of rhythm guitar thing, and I just fancied rocking out for one, and it's kind of got that thing about it, but also lyrically, it's another one that's saying, like, I'm moving on. That was somewhere where I realised I don't want to stay. There were no rules anymore. Let's see where we go now. That's what.
And then finally, well, not finally according to the album, but finally in terms of things I'm going to ask, is Sycamore Tree, because that could have been just a sort of jingly jangly, acousticy sort of folky pop song, but you've produced it in a style that makes it sound like it was recorded, about 120 years ago or something. And clearly that was a deliberate choice. So, I mean, how did you do that? And what was the thinking behind it? I mean,
Well,
it really stands out on the album.
yeah, well, it would sound like it's 100 years old. It's got a synthesizer on it, you know. Dave Wrench played it live, and I mean, it just sounded too tame, so I just put the whole mix through an amp and mic'd the amp up.
Oh, really?
And turned the amp up a bit and distorted it a bit, and I thought, yeah, that sounds right. There's probably a little bit of like, you know, I had been listening to things like Swordfish Trombone by Tom Waits, and there might have been influences of things like, I always like those distorted records like the pop group made, and you know, so, and obviously the Sycamore Tree, it's a kind of meditation on, you know, well, the Sycamore Tree is what Mark Bolan died crashing into. So I had gone to Barnes Common, and really not about him, but it's about, you know, my awakening as a kid to the world of music, because someone that you never, whatever it is that first opens your eyes to it, you never really forget.
Yeah.
So even though some people don't understand and they think that I might be obsessed by Bolan, I'm not. It's just that was my entry point.
Yeah.
And of course, it becomes an emotional attachment to something. So we just happened to drive past Barnes Common, and there it was. And so it was more about that awakening, and what that does for you, and the journey thereafter and stuff. So, and again, you know, that's in drop D tuning for any nerds out there, which means you drop both E's down to a D, and then you get the drone.
Yeah,
and it's pretty much all in one chord, that song, which I love. And I used to love doing it live acoustically because I could go mental on the guitar at the end. I could really find it would just be overtones and noise, and by the end of it would just be, and then it would collapse. So yeah, and that's an important song for me.
Well, it's one that you actually revisited years later. Actually, you put it out.
I did a version with Angelina on Monk's Road. I love Angelina.
I know. Even before that, you did a version that you chucked out on Bandcamp about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, as well. So there's been like 3 different versions of this.
It probably was. Yeah, I did that with Youth, the producer, and that was for some Bolan thing, and they asked me to do some anniversary thing. Yeah, it's one of those that's. But I did it with Angelina, who's this incredible. She's half English, half Chinese, lives on the Isle of Wight. She's got the blues just coming out of her veins. You know, me and her, we sat down at breakfast and just played 2 guitars. And I've never had that connection with anyone where I felt like, you know, oh, you really get it, you know, because I love sort of what you might call country blues, the sort of thing that you hear down in South Carolina, folk song, and Louisiana, and you know, that's really the roots of that. She's got a lot of that in her feel. So yeah, it was good to do that song with her. Yeah,
it really works in every version.
Yeah,
and like I say, this one, whatever you did to it, just sounds like
I just played it and then fucked it up.
It just sounds like you found a record from like 1910 or something and bunged it on live. It's just an astonishing production, I think. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Keyboards are on it, but you just can't tell. It just the whole thing feels like something that just naturally happened.
Yeah, it just shimmers into view and then fucks off again. And you think, what the hell was that?
Right. That's Birds Gotta Fly. I think...
I must say, you've reignited my love for the album. It was one that I hadn't really thought about much at all. And
oh, really?
I haven't listened to it since we did it. Because much went on in my life after it that I went through so many changes that I just forgot about it. But actually now, hearing it through a little bit through your ears and reassessing it, I'm proud of it. It's a good one.
Well, I think that what you do on that album in terms of the songwriting, going back to what I was saying about the riffs sort of maybe being a bit more central and it sort of being influenced a bit more maybe by guitar bands as well as the sort of standard Dr. Robert way of songwriting. And I realise I'm not phrasing this terrifically well because I'm not really a musician myself. But I think Birds Gotta Fly, I think what you do on there, then you can hear the echoes of that in all the things you do afterwards. I think you learn something or you develop something on that album that becomes a part of your armoury. And so what you do afterwards, whether it was influenced deliberately by it or not, I think you can always hear a little bit of it in most of the things you do afterwards. And one of the places afterwards where I think you can hear it quite strongly is the album that I'm going to suggest we do next, because I think this album kind of does for the Blow Monkeys what Birds Gotta Fly did for you in terms of your solo work. And so I'm talking about Feels Like a New Morning, because I think that, perfectly in tune with the title, I think that feels like a bit of a new morning for the Blow Monkeys. And so I'd kind of like to talk about that one next, if that's all right with you.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's a good connection. There's plenty about that one. And also, funnily enough, that was recorded in Bethesda.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we'll dig into that next time. But for now, Robert, thank you so very much again for doing this all over again.
Well, thank you, JR. Cheers.